Greetings. Welcome to the Radcliffe Institute. My name is Sean O'Donnell, and I am the Associate Director of Academic Ventures, and I organize the Roosevelt Poetry Reading here at the Institute. It's wonderful to see such a robust turnout for our poetry reading today. I want to thank you all for coming and for making the Roosevelt Poetry Reading one of the premier poetry events here at the university. Through the Institute's initiative, Radcliffe Engaged, we've continued our outreach to students and communities here at Harvard and beyond. And it is an honor today to have Clint Smith as an example of how interdisciplinary practices can reach beyond academia to affect change. But I should say, I am not here to introduce Clint. In keeping with our focus on student engagement in Radcliffe Engaged, today we've invited Amanda Gorman to offer her own reflections and provide us with an introduction to Clint Smith and his work. As some of you may be aware, Amanda Gorman is a Harvard College senior studying sociology, and she just happens to be the inaugural National Youth Poet Laureate of the United States. She has written for the New York Times and performed several times on CBS This Morning. She has 2 books forthcoming from Viking, and please join me in welcoming Amanda.
Hello, hello, hello. I apologize, my voice is like, 2 octaves lower than usual. I have a slight cold, but we're gonna push through that. I am so excited and happy to be here. And to be honest, I had an introduction planned, and then Clint, being the phenomenal person he is with his phenomenality, ruined it. And this is how I'm going to say how. I am small now, and I was smaller before. I was a junior in high school, and I was trying to decide what I wanted to do with my life, i.e., where I wanted to go to school and what I wanted to study. And we were very fortunate enough that we had Clint Smith come and perform poetry for us. I now thought that he had forgot what had happened 6 years ago, and he had not, apparently, as I found out 15 minutes ago. But I get to share that story all with you because I think it speaks so much to the character of the man, the writer, the scholar that we have joining us here today. I came up to Clint and I told him that I was the LA Youth Poet Laureate. He was excited, and that I was feeling a little bit lost. That was, I think, one of the hardest years for me as a student. The Black Lives Matter movement was underway, and as exhilarating as that was, I remember as an activist and a poet and a student feeling a weight of hopelessness I had not ever felt before. And speaking with Clint that evening, he, in the most eloquent and kind and compassionate manner, taught me about how I needed to see my position in the world. And he said something along the lines of, and I'm going to completely butcher it because it's 6 years afterward, but that I basically did not have to stop the world alone. I did not have to see myself as the singular storm that would cause the change. I was a droplet, I was a piece, I was a part of that, but I wasn't alone in it, which meant that I had no reason to feel hopeless. And looking at that, I was like, wow, look at this poet, handsome, intelligent, he's at Harvard. How about I apply? And so I did, and I got in, and I'm here. So part of the reason of me being here today, being able to introduce Clint, is actually due in part to that journey of having a poet who's willing to go into schools, who's willing to speak with students, and who's willing to bring them and elevate them to the places that he's able to occupy. So that's the brief story, and I'm going to move now into a more eloquent introduction, because he has a lot of accomplishments, which I want to make sure that I rally off. But, you know, it's really difficult to describe Clint Smith. You can call him an educator, an empowerer, a poet of profound performance and prowess, a podium poster on Twitter. I suggest that you follow him because every single one of his tweets, I think, is the Band-Aid that is needed for the world. He's also a scholar and a continuous student, in my head a soothsayer, whose writing isn't just illustrious, but also deeply informed by past, present, and future. Clint Smith is a doctoral candidate at Harvard University and an Emerson Fellow at New America. He has received fellowships from the Arts for Justice Fund, Cave Canem, and the National Science Foundation, while his writing has also been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic Poetry Magazine, The Pairs Review, and more. His first full-length collection of poetry, Counting Descent, which is incredible, was published in 2016 and won the 2017 Literary Award for Best Poetry Book from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, and was a finalist for the NAACP Image Award. As the daughter of an English teacher myself, with all of these accomplishments, one of the most telling, I think, about Clint's character is that he also teaches writing and literature at the DC Central Detention Facility in Washington, DC. I think it's this commitment to always learning, to always teaching, to always truth-telling that makes him the poet that he is. His debut nonfiction book as well, How the World is Past, which explores how different historical sites reckon with or fail to reckon with the relationship to the history of slavery, is forthcoming from Little Brown. And at the end of this, I just really want to give my thanks and gratitude to Clint for not only being the poet that he is, but being the person that he is. And thank you for bringing that into this space. Welcome, Clint Smith.
That was certainly one of the most generous introductions that I've gotten. I'm gonna bring Amanda with me to my Thanksgiving dinner. I'm thrilled to be here. As I told a group of folks earlier, it's very cool to be in this room because I remember 6 years ago when I was a first-year graduate student coming in here and seeing Cornel West do what Cornel West does in front of a podium and being sort of awestruck and starstruck and thinking about how lucky I was to be in a place where I was able to encounter the ideas of so many people whose work I had long admired. And so to be standing here is a very humbling and surreal experience, and I am appreciative that you all came through at like 4:15 in the afternoon, which is an awkward sort of time. But I appreciate you being here with me. and this is going to be, it's listed as a poetry reading and discussion. But if you've seen my work or are familiar with me, this is not a traditional poetry reading. It's going to be, I'm going to have a conversation with you all, and there will be poems that sort of are punctuated throughout. But those poems are largely a sort of catalyst for a different set of discussions that hopefully we can have throughout this and towards the end. And so, a thing I like to tell people is that traditionally when people come to a poetry reading, especially in a place like the Harvard Radcliffe Center, people think you're supposed to sit there and be polite and just say like, and then you do a polite little golf clap at the end. That's whack. We don't do that here. So if you like something, can I hear you snap? If you really, really like something, we say you do the delicious chocolate noise, and that's when you go, Everybody go, And if you really, really like something, it just moves you, you feel it viscerally in your chest, we say you do Jesus, but with a sh, because there's a secular space, so it's like, Jesus, and you fall over on the person next to you. But please check with the person next to you first. It's flu season. We don't need people leaving with issues and contagions. That's not what we need. And so it's interesting because I should also qualify by saying that I came up in the slam poetry scene. In 2014, my team and I won the National Poetry Slam. And, this was when I was in my 20s. I was young and dexterous and I was like gesticulating and everything was like off my memory, off the dome. And then we had kids. And I don't know what happens when you have kids, man, but all of your brain matter sort of like dissipates into the wind. And so we have a 1-year-old and an almost 3-year-old, and they are lovely. But I am also so tired all the time. And I remember I used to go to these poetry readings in DC where I was a teacher and where I kind of came up in the scene. and people go to poetry slams and open mics and all these things, and if somebody got on stage and started reading with an iPad, I'd be like, psh, that's so whack. Like, you'll never see me read off an iPad. Look at that old man reading off an iPad like old people do. And then we had kids, and life is humbling in that way. I truly don't know. I used to be able to memorize everything like it was nothing, and now all I can memorize are like where the Cheerios are in the pantry. And so I am, that is my qualifier. So I'll start with this. You know, a lot of what I think about and a lot of what animates my work, both my scholarship and my poetry, is this idea of history. And it's this idea that one of the sort of central tenets that animate my work is this idea that the history we tell ourselves was a long time ago wasn't actually, in fact, that long ago at all. And I'll talk some more about that. But part of what I think is important, you know, I'm trained as I'm a PhD student at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and the Graduate School of Education. And I just submitted my dissertation 2 weeks ago. So feeling excited and hopeful, and also like I don't know what I do with my body now after so many years of dissertating. But what we think about in sociology all the time is this idea of positionality. And so like thinking about who you are in relation to what you're studying, who you are in relation to your subjects, in relationship to the subject matter. And it is, especially critical sociologists recognize that it is disingenuous, or it is ineffective, and it is actually not rigorous to engage in any sort of quantitative or qualitative study without considering how your specific set of experiences and your lens are shaping the way that you interpret and perceive the things that you're seeing and the things that people are telling you. And so I think something I always try to do is situate myself in relation to the subject matter that I'm talking about. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is the sort of history of racism and white supremacy in this country, and the sort of historiography and lineage that leads us to the contemporary landscape of inequality, and how in order to understand this sort of ecosystem of inequality that exists right now, we have to understand the sort of intergenerational lineage from which it emerges. And so, but before that, I want to, like I said, situate myself in that. And for context, I grew up in New Orleans. I went to a very mixed race, mixed income school and community. I had black friends, white friends, Asian friends. It was like the Disney Channel. It was great. You know, we were riding our bikes with theme music playing in the background. Our hair was blowing in the wind. It's clearly their hair and not my hair. And my dad would always say, he's like, I love that you have such a diverse group of friends. That's why we sent you to this school. That's why we moved to this neighborhood. But you have to understand that the implications for the decisions that you make might be very different for you than they are for your other friends. And when you're a kid, you don't understand that. When you're a kid, you're just like, you're the mean dad, you're the strict dad. Why can't you be more like Tommy's dad? And he's like, Tommy don't live in this house. And then he walks away very dramatically because he watches too many Denzel Washington movies. And you're just like, please, Dad, we're in a restaurant. This is a public place. You're embarrassing me. And it wasn't until Tamir Rice was killed. Tamir Rice, as many of us know, a 12-year-old boy who was killed in Cleveland, Ohio in 2015, shot while playing with a toy gun in a park in an open carry state. Police shot him within 2 seconds of them pulling up to the scene. And I think about how what happened to Tamir Rice was a moment in my own life that represented the way that what had previously been a sort of youthful abstraction became very real and became very concrete. And it was the manifestation of my parents' worst fears for what would happen to their son. And I think it is a manifestation of the worst fears that exist for so many black parents. And I think about the intergenerational nature of the talk that we talk about in black families, and how my grandfather had a conversation with me, and I had a conversation, and my grandfather had a conversation with my father, and my father had a conversation with me, and I will one day have a conversation with my son, who is 2.5 years old right now, and when we walk through the grocery store, everybody talks about how cute and adorable he is, but what does it mean to communicate to that young person and to know that at some point he won't be considered adorable and he'll be considered something much different and something much more egregious and insidious, that people will consider him a threat rather than a child. And so what does it mean to communicate that to someone without making it seem as if it is somehow their fault? And that is the sort of delicate balancing act, I think, of raising black children. All to say, this is a poem I wrote a few years ago after Tamir Rice was killed. And it is the one from which my TED Talk eventually emerged, that is thinking about the story of Tamir and putting my own life and set of experiences in conversation with it. One night when I was 12 years old, on an overnight field trip to another city, my friends and I bought super soakers, turned the hotel parking lot into our own water-filled battle zone. We hid behind cars, running through the darkness that lay between the streetlights. Boundless laughter ubiquitous across the pavement. But within 10 minutes, my father came outside, grabbed me by my forearm, and led me into our room with an unfamiliar grip. Before I could say anything, tell him how foolish he made me look in front of my friends, he derided me for being so naive. Looked me in the eye, fear consuming his face, and said, "Son, I'm sorry, but you can't act the same as your white friends. You can't pretend to shoot guns. You can't run around in the dark. You can't hide behind anything other than your own teeth." I know now how scared he must have been, how easily I could have fallen into the empty of the night, that some man would mistake this water for a good reason to wash all of this away. These are the sorts of messages I was inundated with my entire life. Always keep your hands where they can see them. Don't move too quickly. Take off your hood when the sun goes down. My parents raised me and my siblings in an armor of advice, an ocean of alarm bells so someone wouldn't steal the breath from our lungs, so that they wouldn't make a memory of this skin, so that we could be kids, not casket or concrete. And it's not because they thought it would make us better than anyone else. It's simply because they wanted to keep us alive. All of my black friends were raised with the same message. The talk given to us when we became old enough to be mistaken for a nail ready to be hammered to the ground, when people made our melanin synonymous with something to be feared. But what does it do to a child to grow up knowing that you cannot simply be a child, that the whims of adolescence are too dangerous for your breath, that you cannot simply be curious, you are not afforded the luxury of making a mistake, that someone's implicit bias might be the reason you don't wake up in the morning? But this cannot be what defines us. We have parents who raised us to understand that our bodies weren't meant for the backside of a bullet, but for flying kites and jumping rope and laughing until our stomachs burst. We had teachers who taught us how to raise our hands in class and not just to signal surrender, and that the only thing we should give up is the idea that we aren't worthy of this world. So when we say that Black lives matter, it's not because others don't. It's simply because we must affirm that we are worthy of existing without fear, when there are so many things that tell us we are not. I want to live in a world where my son will not be presumed guilty the moment he is born, where a toy in his hand isn't mistaken for anything other than a toy. And I refuse to accept that we can't build this world into something new, some place where a child's name doesn't have to be written on a t-shirt or a tombstone, where the value of someone's life isn't determined by anything other than the fact that they had lungs, a place where every single one of us can breathe. So this always happens. So you snap during the poem, and then you clap after the poem. If you snap after the poem, it turns into like a weird 90s R&B video, and like, I know the lights are dim, but that's not quite the vibe we are going for here. So something that I think about, and something that animates a lot of my work is, again, thinking about how the history we tell ourselves was long ago wasn't in fact that long ago at all. And I always give this timeline because I think it's really important and really helpful in sort of grounding the conversation. But the first enslaved people came to this country in 1619. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863. Civil War ended in 1865. Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were 1964 and 1965. The Federal Housing Act was 1968. So it's only been about 50 years in which Black people in this country even had a semblance of legal and legislative freedom. For 350 years prior to that, it was fundamentally legal to discriminate against, dehumanize, delegitimize, and disenfranchise Black people. Not in an interpersonal, somebody being mean and using the N-word, but like you were a state-sanctioned second-class citizen if you were considered a citizen at all. So if you were to kick somebody for 350 years and then ostensibly stop kicking them for a seventh of the amount of time that you spent kicking them, it would be both morally and intellectually disingenuous to then look at that group of people and be like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you have the same economic outcomes? Why don't you have the same academic outcomes? Why so much violence and poverty in your community? When we know the answers to these questions, right? But we have a deeply sort of ahistorical lens through which we're thinking about this thing. And I always think about how the US's history is so recent compared to so many other countries. When I think about that timeline, like I went on a trip to England about a year ago. And we were walking around and we were on a tour of Oxford University. And we were walking around, the person was giving us a tour, and they were showing us these different buildings and like telling us when all these buildings were built. And he stopped, the tour guide, and he looked at this one building, and he said, this building was built around 1020. And I was like, Like AM or PM? Like what? Like I couldn't even conceptualize the idea that a building that had been built a millennium ago was still standing and functioning, operating as such. But what it reminds me is that the United States, again, history is so recent. We're so young. We're like the annoying preteen of the world, right? Like increasingly so. And I think it's a reminder that, like, you know, slavery is this thing that people talk about. They're like, oh, slavery, you know, there are all the movies and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, we talk about it all the time. But like relative to the impact that that institution had on the contemporary landscape of the United States, I would argue we don't talk about it nearly enough, as much as we do, right? And we know that in 1860, according to David Blight, historian at Yale University, the 4 million enslaved black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined. The single greatest catalyst of wealth this country has ever known. The reason the United States exists as a global economic superpower is impossible to disentangle from the 250 years of enslaved labor that it used through black people. And it's one of those things too where it's a thing where it feels very distant, but isn't. And I was reminded of this personally. So the book that I'm working on, How the Word is Passed, is I go to, as was mentioned, these different historical sites across the country and think about how they reckon with or fail to reckon with their relationship to the history of slavery. And so I go to, the Whitney Plantation, which is a place in Louisiana, which is one of the only plantations in the country that very directly centers the experiences of enslaved people, rather than saying, this is the designer of the windows, and this is the architecture of the house, and this is where the workers stayed, and this is, all these ahistorical and offensive euphemisms, and what does it mean for that place to be surrounded by sort of constellations of plantations where people have weddings, where people have parties, where people have balls? Like, what does it mean? How can a piece of land mean something so different to so many different people? Or I go to Angola Plantation, or Angola Prison. Look at me saying Angola Plantation, but that gives it away. Angola Prison, which is the largest maximum security prison in the country, and it is a prison that was built on top of a former plantation, and it is a maximum security prison where approximately 85% of the people held there are black men. If we were in Germany and you had a prison that was on top of a former concentration camp in which 85% of its occupants were Jewish, it would be a global emblem of anti-Semitism, as it should be, right? We would have people protesting outside of it every day saying, you have to close this place. You cannot build a prison that incarcerates disproportionately Jewish people on top of a former concentration camp. It is wildly offensive, and it is not compatible with the sort of values and ethics that we purport to hold. And yet, here in the U.S., and it's not we have a situation where the largest prison in the country that incarcerates disproportionately black men is on top of a former plantation that was the site of violence and exploitation and genocide for decades. And I'm thinking about how white supremacy is something that both enacts violence against people's bodies, but also numbs us to certain types of violence that we should otherwise find wildly offensive. And so I go to these different places, but in the last chapter, I do these interviews with my grandparents. Because as a writer and a researcher, I find that I have spent so much time asking strangers about their life stories and have not necessarily brought that same level of intentionality to my relationships with my own family. And so I was having this conversation with my grandmother, and there was a moment where she was talking about, she was holding my then 2-month-old daughter on her lap, and she was telling me a story about how she used to sit on her grandfather's lap. And she was telling me about her grandfather, this person who raised her after both of her parents passed away from tuberculosis in the 1930s, that man was born into slavery. And so it was this very visceral moment in which my daughter was sitting on the lap of someone who sat on the lap of someone who was born into slavery. And again, it's just this idea that we've convinced ourselves through our textbooks and through these black and white videos and through these images that this was a long, long, long time ago. But truly it wasn't. And slavery is, we don't even have to go all the way back to that, because what we know is that in terms of the way that that impacts what the world looks like today, we can think about how, slavery ended 1865, and although there had initially been the promise of like 40 acres and a mule, or you'll get, we're going to take the land from the former Confederates and we're going to give it to the now freed, formerly enslaved folks, That didn't happen for a variety of reasons, among them Lincoln being assassinated. And Andrew Johnson, who was, for a long time, I thought that he was the worst president. Now it might be a tie. And Andrew Johnson was a deeply racist Democrat when the parties were flipped. And he made it so that that wasn't the case. And instead what they did was they told all the black people who had been freed, okay, we're not gonna give you land, we're not gonna give you access to capital, but what we'll do is we'll create this place called the Freedmen's Bank, and you can deposit all your money into the Freedmen's Bank, and it will accrue interest, and over time, you will have money to give to your intergenerational wealth to give to your children and their children and their children. But what happened is that in 9 years after the Freedmen's Bank opened in 1865, in 1874, the Freedmen's Bank went under. And when it went under, because of railroad speculation from the people who were running the bank, half of the wealth in black America disappeared overnight. Like half in the entire country. And this was 9 years after the end of enslavement. And I say that because I think there's an endless array of examples that one can provide that provide insight and provide context and provide perspective that can help us understand how the wealth gap has begun to exist, and the reason that one part of Boston looks one way and another part of Boston looks another way is not necessarily at all reflective of the people in those communities, but is instead reflective of things that have been done to those communities generation after generation after generation after generation. And we don't even have to go back to slavery, right? I can talk about slavery all day. I hope you pre-order my book when it's available. But I think the other thing, we talk about the New Deal. The New Deal, what I was taught, in my American history classes, was the single greatest catalyst of intergenerational wealth over the course of a century. It was responsible for the creation of the contemporary middle class. It is the thing that lifted people out of poverty after the war, after the Depression, and took them from poverty into middle-class homes in the suburbs, took the uneducated and the illiterate and helped them get college degrees, and it built the financial and economic, it was the economic bedrock of this country. And what's also true, what I didn't learn until many years later when I read a book called Fear Itself by a historian named Ira Katz Nelson over at Columbia, is that when the New Deal was signed, it did provide all of those things, that is true, but it also very intentionally didn't provide those things to black people, specifically black people in the South, right, where the majority of black people lived in the early 20th century. And so you have the single greatest catalyst of wealth, and you give it to one group of people, and you don't give it to a different group of people, Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing mortgages, health care, GI Bill, all of these different things. You give it to one group of people and you don't give it to another group of people. And then people want to act surprised generations later when there are disparate outcomes along the lines that these resources were given, right? And so there's example after example after example that it illuminates and demonstrates that the reason that black Americans find themselves in the sort of social conditions that we do writ large has nothing to do with notions of personal responsibility, has nothing to do with notions of working hard, or have nothing to do with the sort of mythology around an innate sense of violence or disposition toward violence or disposition toward poverty, but is instead, again, reflective of resources that have been extracted from one community and given to another community. This is the part of the thing where I always forget that I'm supposed to be doing poems. And so here is a poem. Part of what I also think about, another chapter in the book is about Monticello. And so Monticello is, for those who don't know, it is Thomas Jefferson's home, and it is a plantation. And I think Jefferson is an interesting character because Jefferson is in many ways a microcosm for America, in that Jefferson, that I was taught through my K-12 education, I was taught he was the intellectual founding father of this country. He is responsible for the conception of the Declaration of Independence, helped Madison write the Constitution. He is the architect of our American ideals. He represents the best of American aspirations. And what I was never taught, what I didn't learn until many years later when I read Notes on the State of Virginia, which is his memoir, his manifesto of sorts. And in it, he says very explicitly, he says, black people are inherently inferior to white people in both endowments of body and mind. He says the slave is incapable of love. The slave is incapable of possessing and sustaining complex emotion. He writes about Phyllis Wheatley, who's considered to be the first published African-American poet in the history of the United States. He's like, well, black people don't necessarily possess the artistic or intellectual acumen with which to create art. So we can call this something else, but we shouldn't call it poetry because black people don't possess the necessary artistic capacity with which to create beautiful things. He said it was, quote, beneath the dignity of criticism. And so I think about that, and I think about how that's a version of Jefferson that I was never taught. And I think about how Jefferson is, again, this microcosm for American history in which we are so committed to the idea of American exceptionalism that we end up suppressing any story that makes us look unexceptional or that complicates the picture that we have, right? But what is true is that we have to hold a set of complicated truths at once, because it is true that Jefferson was a brilliant man, and it is also true that he is deeply racist. It is true that Jefferson helped write the Declaration of Independence, and it is also true that he enslaved over 600 people, including 4 of his own children, right? And so it is essential, for me, it is essential that like the fullness of that story be told, because that actually explains a lot more about the myriad of contradictions that exist in this country, that it is a place of great opportunity for many, which it is, and that opportunity has often come at the expense of other people, and often that opportunity exists because of sets of oppression or systems of oppression that exist to prevent other people from having those opportunities. And so this is a poem, I'm really interested in the sort of mythology of the Founding Fathers and how we remember who they are. I just read a thing yesterday about how George Washington's teeth, which I always taught were like, oh, he had these wooden teeth and these wooden dentures, but were instead teeth that had been yanked and extracted from his enslaved workers and put into dentures and then put into his mouth. And I think that there are there's story after story about this. And to their credit, I think places like Mount Vernon and Monticello and Montpelier, with regard to Jefferson and Washington and Madison respectively, are doing a better job of talking more frankly about that part of their history, because for so long they didn't. And for so long you would go to these plantations and they would talk about these great men, but not talk about the people who built the homes that these great men ostensibly lived in. So this is a poem called History Reconsidered, after which the talk is named. And it is thinking about how what we know is that 12 of our first 18 presidents owned slaves, 8 of them owned slaves while they were in office, and this poem is a letter to 5 of them. Letter to 5 of the presidents who owned slaves while they were in office. George Washington, when you won the revolution, how many of your soldiers did you send from the battlefield to the cotton field? How many had to trade in their rifles for plows? Can you blame the slaves who ran away to fight for the British? Because at least the redcoats were honest about their oppression. Thomas Jefferson, when you told Sally Hemings that you would free her children if she remained your mistress, did you think there was honor in your ultimatum? Did you think we wouldn't be able to recognize the assault in your signature, just raping your slave, when you disguise it as bribery, make it less of a crime? When you wrote the Declaration of Independence, did you ever intend for black people to have freedom over their bodies? James Madison. When you wrote to Congress that black people should count as 3/5 of a person, how long did you have to look at your slaves to figure out the math? Was it easy to chop them up? Did you think they'd be happy being more than just half human? James Monroe. When you proposed sending slaves back to Africa, did black bodies feel like rented tools? When you branded them, did the scar on their chest include an expiration date? When you named the country Liberia, were you trying to be ironic? Does this really count as liberation? Andrew Jackson, was the Trail of Tears not enough for you? Was killing Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminoles not enough to quench your imperialism? How many brown bodies do you have to bulldoze before you can call it progress, Mr. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson? When you put your hand on the Bible and swore to protect this country, let's be honest in who you were talking about. When the first Independence Day fireworks set the sky aflame, don't forget where we were watching from. So when you remember Jefferson's genius, don't forget the slaves who built the bookshelves in his library. When you remember Jackson's victories in war, don't forget what he is fighting to preserve. When you sing that this country was founded on freedom, don't forget the duet of shackles dragging against the ground my entire life. I've been taught how perfect this country was, but no one ever told me about the pages torn out of my textbook, how black and brown bodies have been bludgeoned for 3 centuries and find no place in the curriculum. Oppression doesn't disappear just because you decided not to teach us that chapter. If you only hear one side of the story, at some point you have to question who the writer is. So another part of the book is thinking about the way it is thinking about how we memorialize and create monuments to a history that is only telling a part of the story. And so I grew up in New Orleans, and I grew up underneath or surrounded by a pervasive iconography of Confederate statues. And it was interesting because, for a long time I didn't fully understand what these statues were and what they meant. But it is telling when a city of majority Black people, when the largest or the highest statue in the city is a statue of Robert E. Lee, and is the statue of a man who, to be clear, was the general who fought a war to maintain and expand the institution of slavery in hopes of it existing in perpetuity. And he is someone who owned enslaved people himself. He is someone who killed enslaved people en masse, even as they were trying to surrender during the war, or when they were Union soldiers. And so this is not, what does it mean that we are lifting this person up, and what does it mean about the story that we tell? Because the story that I got my entire life is like, Robert E. Lee, he's misunderstood, and he is this person who just fought to protect his state, and he is a soul. We might have disagreed with him, but he was a valiant soldier and should be celebrated as such. And we say that about so many of the people in the Confederacy, and it's interesting because you go and you read the primary source documents, and like the Declarations of Confederate Secession, for example. If you go and read the Declarations of Confederate Secession, all of the southern states that left had conventions of secession in which they got together and they outlined the reasons they were leaving. And so we tell ourselves now that, when I say we, I mean this country says, the Confederacy was about far more than slavery. It didn't actually have anything to do with slavery. It's more about states' rights and economics and tariffs. It was very complicated. But it wasn't that complicated, because if you read the Declarations of Confederate Secession, they're very clear. They're like, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, this is about slavery, right? Like, they're not opaque in their rationale for why they are deciding to leave. If you read the Cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens, who is the vice president of the Confederacy, he's like, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, no, this is 100% definitely, no question, all about slavery. We want to keep it going. And so it's fascinating, right, because the primary source documents are very clear, right? All the contemporaneous evidence demonstrates that the secession happened and subsequently the war took place because the southern states seceded over the issues of enslavement after Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860. What's also interesting is that if you look at, there was a recent study by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it showed that only 8% of US high school seniors are able to identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. 8. And so it's telling, but part of what it reflects is this idea that the success of what is called the lost cause, right? This idea of the lost cause being the way that after the war ended in 1865, Southerners, through literature, through media, through textbooks, through school curriculums, warped and distorted the actual original intent of the war and convinced everybody that it wasn't actually about the thing that they had spent 4 years fighting over. It was about other reasons that had nothing to do with Black people, had nothing to do with slavery. That was largely a side issue. and they were successful in that. And part of that success meant entangling slavery with this idea of political indoctrination. And so now teachers are afraid to talk about slavery in their classrooms because they are made to feel as if talking extensively about it and outlining what it actually did and how it actually shaped America's history is somehow akin to a leftist indoctrination of your students. And so a lot of teachers don't do it, even though all they have to do is provide primary source evidence and documents that this was the case. And so I find it fascinating, and I spent a lot of time in the book thinking about the Confederate statues in New Orleans and the Confederate statues in Richmond and the legacy of the Confederacy more generally. One of the places I go in the book is a place called Blandford Cemetery, and it's the largest Confederate cemetery in the country. The remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried there. And I went there for the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration. So it was a fascinating day. I was very conspicuous, as you can imagine. But it was illuminating because part of what it demonstrated, excuse me, is that so much of the reason that people tell themselves a certain story about themselves is tied to family, is tied to lineage, and that all of the people who I saw there and who I spoke to were unwilling to accept that the war had been fought over what it was actually fought over, because if they were to accept that, it would implicate their great-great-grandfather, which would then implicate their entire lineage, which they feel would then implicate them. And so, so much of history is people creating a story about a moment that fits into the story about themselves that they want to hear or that they want to continue to tell. And so this is a poem that's actually an excerpt from the book, part of the book. When you're a poet, sometimes I'll write a poem and then later I'll just make the lines into sentences and then I stick it in there and I tell my editor that it's now a bunch of paragraphs when it was before a poem, and I was like, haha, I tricked you. But this is a poem that I wrote that was actually part of the genesis of the book, and then I just kind of stuck it in there. Excuse my coughing. There's it's really bad flu season coming around. Both of my kids were just sick with the flu last week, and we called it Flugate, and it was rough. I love my children more than anything. By the end of that week, I was also like, nobody talks to me. I'm over everything, and now I have the ruins of or the remnants of a cough. Growing up, the iconography of the Confederacy was an ever-present fixture of my daily life. Every day on the way to school, I passed a statue of P.G.T. Beauregard riding on a horseback, his Confederate uniform slung over his shoulder and his military cap pulled far down over his eyes. As a child, I did not know who P.G.T. Beauregard was. I did not know he was the man who ordered the first attack that opened the Civil War. I did not know he was one of the architects who designed the Confederate national flag. I did not know he led an army predicated on maintaining the institution of slavery. What I knew is that he looked like so many of the other statues that ornamented the edges of the city. These copper garlands of a past that saw truth as something that should be buried underground and silenced by the soil. After the war, the sons and daughters of the Confederacy reshaped the contours of treason into something they could name as honorable. They called it the lost cause, and it crept its way into textbooks that attempted to cover up a crime that was still unfolding. They told us that Robert E. Lee was an honest man, guilty of nothing but fighting for the state and the people that he loved, that the Southern flag was about heritage and remembering those slain fighting to preserve their way of life. But the thing about the lost cause is that it's only lost if you're not looking. The thing about heritage is that it's a war that also means I'm ignoring what we did to you. I was taught the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but I was never taught how the declarations of Confederate secession had the promise of human bondage carved into its stone. I was taught how the war was about economics, but I was never taught how that in 1860, the 4 million slaves were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined. I was taught that the Civil War was about states' rights, but I was never taught how the Fugitive Slave Act could care less about a border and spell Georgia and Massachusetts the exact same way. It's easy to look at a flag and call it heritage if you don't see the black bodies buried behind it. It's easy to look at a statue and call it history when you ignore the laws written in its wake. I come from a city abounding with statues of white men on pedestals and black children playing beneath them, where we played trombones and trumpets to drown out the Dixie song that still whistled in the wind. In New Orleans, there are over 100 schools, roads, and buildings named for Confederate soldiers. Every day, black children walk into buildings named after people who didn't want them to exist. Every time I return home, I drive on streets named for those who didn't think of me as human. Go straight for 2 miles on Robert E. Lee. Take a left on Jefferson Davis. Make the first right on Claiborne. Translation, go straight for 2 miles on the general who slaughtered black soldiers who were trying to surrender. Take a left on the president of the Confederacy who named the torture of black bodies as the cornerstone of his new nation. Make the first right on the man who mounted heads of the rebelling slaves on stakes and spread them across the city in order to prevent the others from getting any ideas. What name is there for this sort of violence? What do you call it when the road you walk on is named for those who imagined you under a noose? What do you call it when the roof over your head is named after people who would have wanted the bricks to crush you? So as you can tell, like a lot of the poems that I write, not all of them are historically oriented, and part of what I think about, and I was telling the students this before, is that like my idea of a good time is sitting in the basement of Widener Library, sitting in the stacks, and like reading a 700-page book by Du Bois and eating a bag of hot Cheetos. Like that is a perfect afternoon. And I recognize that for a myriad of reasons, that is not a perfect afternoon for everyone. But part of what I'm interested in is, I'm a 6th-year graduate student, and I am have spent the last several years being very lucky in that my primary job is to read and to write and to think about inequality. And I'm always interested in what it means to provide different means and mechanisms by which to provide and communicate that information that has been transformative for me in my own learning experience to others who might not have the time or the resources or the social capital with which to have access to certain types of texts and ideas. And so, some of what I do is I'll read a book. I read a book on the New Deal, and I was like, well, how can I turn Ira Katznelson's 500-page book on the history of racism in the New Deal into a 2-minute poem? And this is my attempt to do that. In 1932, the Great Depression had taken America by the throat and rendered it an alchemy of dust and rations. The country had been decimated by a market that could no longer hold up a history of hypocrisy, and it crashed like something that has never before known what it meant to fall. In response, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed a series of legislative acts designed to lift the country from its knees. The laws transformed the economy and are responsible for the foundation that created the contemporary middle class. In the 1930s, 75% of Southern black folks were either maids or farm workers. In the 1930s, the only workers who didn't qualify for the benefits of the New Deal were maids and farm workers. I was told you can only call something a coincidence if it wasn't done on purpose. A coincidence is texting with a friend and then running into them at the grocery store. A coincidence is showing up to the office in the same new shirt as your coworker. A coincidence is walking past a vending machine and finding some quarters in your pocket. Taking away all federal benefits from an entire demographic of people feels like we should call it something different, something a little more honest, something a little more empirically grounded. But see, the thing about racism in America is that if you don't call it racism, people think it isn't there. It's the shadow no one can see when it is standing right behind you. It's the carbon monoxide killing you in a room where there is no smoke. 1 million black folks end up in prison and people shrug and ask what happened. An unarmed man is shot by police when he is running in the opposite direction and people call it self-defense. Interstate highways are built through black communities and people suddenly can't explain why all the businesses have failed. If you take away Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing, mortgages, and health care, you don't get to then turn around, see poverty, and act like you're surprised. How can you take the water from a fish tank and not expect the fish to suffocate, to gasp for its life, to flap violently against the surface while you watch from the other side of the glass? When a fish dies from having no water, do we call that a coincidence? If you block the sun from reaching a tree, do you have to ask why it doesn't grow? The government won't give you a loan to buy a house in a better neighborhood, then they blame you when your son gets shot. The city never built a hospital on your side of town, and then they tell you it's your fault that the cancer spread. They stuff you into public housing, then tear it down and ask why all the schools are empty. If we didn't say it directly, you can't blame us when it happens. If we continue to keep our eyes shut, it can't be our fault that we don't see you. But see, this country is only able to whisper the words American exceptionalism because we're so good at covering our ears while someone else is screaming. Another thing that I've been thinking a lot about is the sort of, I think it took a long time for me I spent a lot of time thinking about the sort of domestic implications of white supremacy and racism. And I think it took longer for me to come to develop a sort of international and global analysis of the way in which that history and the history of colonialism and imperialism has shaped and rocked and created political instability across the world. And I think a lot about, I've been writing a lot of poems that are, and a lot of this is shaped by having kids, but considering the ostensible limits of our empathy and this idea that we are, so often we mourn the lives or mourn the deaths of people we are proximate to, or people who look like us, or people who pray like us, in ways that we'd fail to mourn those in other places. And I'm always having to check myself on that too, because I think it can be very easy to see there was a suicide bomber in Kabul, or there was a terrorist attack in Somalia, or there was this many dozens of people died in Pakistan, or whatever the case may be. And you can get in the habit of just kind of scrolling by or flipping the channel because it feels so normative. It is made to feel as if the implications of like 50 people dying from a suicide bomber in a market in Afghanistan feels very different to us than 50 people being shot in a mall in Minnesota. And I always have to ask myself why, right? Like, why is it that that feels less hurtful? Why is it that that feels less upsetting than it would if they were Americans? And I think about the sort of the way that the arbitrary notions of like nationality shape who we do and do not grieve for. And so these are 3 poems. I'll read them back to back, and then I'll read just like a few more poems before we get to Q&A, because I want to hear from you all. So I'll read this sort of 3-part suite of poems. Imagine each continent a splintered tessellation of wayward fragments, each mass of land attempting to jostle itself free. Pangaea was the last of the supercontinents, a mass of land that came together and broke itself apart several times before. It should come as no surprise. Don't we all find ourselves coming back to something we can lose ourselves inside of? Can we blame the desert for missing the breeze that tumbles across the grassland? Can we blame the tundra for a desire to witness the wrestling of pines? Just the other day, a bomb killed 70 people in Pakistan and no one around me heard a sound. These days, I find myself blaming Pangaea for the sounds I cannot hear. I decry the continents for their careless drift. I detest the tectonic plates for their indifferent quake. I wake up in love with the ocean and fall asleep despising all that is put between us. Perhaps if the continents had never shaken themselves free of one another, we might find ourselves disabused of this apathy. Perhaps if we could hear the bomb dropping, we might imagine what would happen if it struck our own home. I'm nostalgic for a proximity that may not have mattered. I find myself loathing a miracle. The drone was once a scrap of metal. The drone looks as if it might be a toy. The drone is not a toy. The drone could have been something other than a killing machine. The drone could have been a house. The drone could have been a spoon. The drone could have been a swing. The drone does not know who it is going to kill next. The drone is going to kill next. The drone has learned to disguise itself as a shard of sky. The drone's soft hum is a disembodied echo. The drone was mistaken for a star once. The drone renders itself celestial. The drone scoffs at sovereignty. The drone asks, what is a border if you can fly right over it? The drone was built by a man. The drone killed a man and a woman and a child. The drone killed a child and did not see her face. The drone does not see a face. The drone sees a body, and then the body is gone. The New York Times reports that 200 Iraqi civilians have been killed by US military airstrikes. And the man on television calls it unfortunate yet inevitable collateral damage. And I wonder what it is that turns mourning into a metonym or a proclamation of conjecture. And I read his bio, and I see that he has a wife, and I can't imagine he would call it inevitable if her body were pulled from the quiet implosion of scattered rubble. And I see that he has a son, and I can't imagine he would call the boy who bears his name collateral in someone else's war. And I see that he has a daughter, and I think of what it might mean for someone to render her final breath in inevitability of global politics. And I understand what he means. I know he means that war is callous and unforgiving, that a militant can surround himself with a dozen women and children so that the pilot must decide between a target and the soft ache of his own heart's detonation. I do not misunderstand the cruelty of war, but I regret the way we talk about its casualties, how their lives become tacit admonitions, how the tyranny of a border made out of thin air means bombs are only dropped on one side of it. But I too have felt the empathy corrode inside the most cavernous parts of me, have taken the quarters in my pocket and used them to cover my collusion. Who among us has not used spare change to ornament our contrition, laid a garland of rations atop the bodies of names we do not know? And I'm not sure what it means for us not to be the one to fire the bullet, but to behave as if the bullet always belonged in that chest and not our own. So I'll just do one more poem. So much of the work that we create is shaped by the moments that, what is happening in our lives. So my first book, which came out in 2016, is largely in conversation with the movement for Black Lives and thinking about the sort of incessant inundation of images of black people being killed by the state, and thinking about coming of age as a young black person the 30 years prior to that sort of visual history. And my next poetry collection, which is coming out not next year, but the year after, because in publishing, they make you spread it out, is largely about fatherhood. And so it's a lot of dad poems. And so I have a lot of poems that are like, my wife and I had fertility issues, and were very unsure that we would ever have biological children. And it ended up working out that way. But it kind of explores our journey from being told it was very unlikely we would have our own children to having these two sort of miracle children exist, and all of the remarkable joy and fatigue that comes with it. And so how are we doing on time? I think I've gone over time, but I always do this. I'll go ahead and I'll just read one. But it is, I think, reflective of a larger sensibility of the collection, which is in a lot of ways very different from my first one. So I should also say, so this poem is called Ode to the Electric Baby Swing. And I made a mistake when I first read it. I remember a few months ago, or maybe a year ago now, I first read this poem, and I said the title, I was like, Ode to the Electric Baby Chair. And that was the reaction that happened. And I didn't understand, because I think I wrote swing but said chair, and I was like, I love the electric baby chair. Thank God for the electric chair. And then I got off stage, and people were like, oh my God, what is wrong with him? And my homie was like, Clint, you can't say that. You can't talk about how happy you are to put your child in the electric chair. And I was like, oh, I see what's happening now. So I got to keep my children after that. But know that this is about the electric baby swing, which is very different than the electric baby chair. Ode to the Electric Baby Swing. When we first met, I wasn't really thinking I needed someone like you, but a friend told me we'd be a good fit, especially with everything happening in my life, and all the changes, and all the uncertainty. And he said it would be nice to have someone you can count on. He said he used to have someone just like you. And while I think he and I have slightly different tastes, I thought it couldn't hurt if we at least gave it a chance to meet. And my wife said it might be nice to introduce something new into the fold, which left me a bit confused by how open she was to the possibility of you. I mean, she was never this open to throwing new things into our relationship before, but I digress. Anyway, I agreed, and when you first showed up at my door, you didn't look anything like the pictures I saw online, and you came so broken and in so many different pieces, which left me worried because I wasn't looking for a project, I need to focus on my career. But you were already here, and the residue of my Catholic guilt wouldn't let me shut the door on you. So you came in, and we sat together on the floor, and we put on some Kenny G, and I helped you put yourself together the best way I knew how. And man, am I glad we got past that first awkward stage, because now you are literally the best thing that has ever happened to me. I truly cannot imagine my life without you. In that moment, I handed you my son, and he fell asleep in your hold, and I danced in the living room because before he refused to sleep, and now he sleeps when you hold him, and my wife thinks I love you more than I love her. And I'm not saying she's right, but I'm not saying she's wrong. But I am saying you give me something she doesn't. And don't get me wrong, I love the mother of my son. It's just that you make me feel young again. So, a slight tonal shift. But I just wanted to end on that, and if folks have questions, I think we have time. The mic is right there, and I think we have time for 10 or 15 minutes or so.
Thank you so much. My question is actually about your response to Mitch Landrieu's speech about removing the Confederate monuments. I found it one of the most moving things, partly because I think it's so important for white people to speak up about the importance of acknowledging the past history.
Yeah.
And as a white person, I just thought it was, and I've sent it out to a whole bunch of people so that they can understand, as you've put in some other writing. So I'm just curious for you, particularly from being that, what you thought of it.
Yeah,
and its
no,
importance or not.
I thought Mitch's speech, if you haven't read it, you should. It's a speech Mitch Landrieu gave, I believe in maybe 2016 or 2017, right before he left office, about the Confederate statues in New Orleans and why it was his journey to understanding why it was important for them to come down. And I believe he wrote a book kind of based on that speech after. I thought it was a very powerful speech, and I think for the reasons you said, I think it's important for white people and white politicians in the South, frankly, to speak to that history and to speak honestly and to speak frankly. I think my one critique would be that there was a very long history of activism from black folks in New Orleans who advocated taking these statues down for a very, very long time. And I have not read his book, but in the speech, he talks about his conversations he had with different black people in his life and how it became clear to him that this was something that couldn't continue. And obviously the sort of larger catalyst was what happened with Dylann Roof and what happened with the Confederate flag in South Carolina. But I will say I think it is important. I think this is a similar thing to lots of white politicians who do ostensibly good things. So like Lincoln, for example, if you watch, I actually very much enjoy the Lincoln movie by Steven Spielberg. What I don't enjoy about it is that it makes it seem as if it were simply Lincoln and his pen and his team of rivals that were the catalyst to the 13th Amendment and implicitly the catalyst to the previous Emancipation Proclamation beforehand. When in reality it was like black abolitionists had been pushing Lincoln for years and years and years. Frederick Douglass was in his ear all the time talking about how this is essential both for the war effort, but also most importantly on a sort of moral grounds to emancipate the enslaved. And I don't think there were any black people who had active roles in that movie. And I think movies and films like that can make it seem as if it was singularly benevolent white people who were the reason that this good thing happened to black people. And I think that the thing to be careful of with Mitch is that he is the mayor, he made a great speech, and I am happy that he was on that. Everybody's journey is different, and I am happy that he reached this conclusion of his journey. I think it's also important for him, and again, maybe he speaks about this book in his book, but I'm not sure, to lift up the stories of the activists and the historians and the folks in New Orleans who for generations have been saying these statues need to come down, and it only when this mass murder happens in a church in South Carolina does anybody pay attention to what we've been saying for a long time.
Hey, what's up, fam? My name's Alejandro. I'm from the West Coast.
How you doing?
And I heard your name before, so I just came through because I wanted to meet you. But then I listened to your whole talk, and I had a question if music is any influence in the way you write, because from your first poem, the one inspired by the murder of Timmy Rice, the way you wrote that, the cadence it had to it, at least spiritually, it reminded me of Thug's Mansion. Tupac, where he says a place where we could, all that.
Yeah.
And then the second one, it reminded me of his song, A Letter to the President, because you were writing to all them presidents.
Word.
And I just kind of caught that, and I was curious. And then one thing, just a comment that it's good to see you here, and it's good to see a man of color, doing your thing, because in the School of Ed, it's not a lot of us.
Word.
And even in this room, it's mostly women. And so it's all love, but
I hear you.
Real talk is nothing to laugh about. We're not here, bro.
Yeah.
Real talk, we're not here. We're everywhere but here. So just hella love for that.
I appreciate you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I wish I was a rapper. I think it would be. I don't have the range to translate my work into bars, but it certainly is influenced by that, right? I mean, hip hop I consider hip hop a part of the black literary tradition. You know what I mean? It is Kendrick is as much part of the literary tradition as Baldwin and Du Bois and Zora Neale Hurston and the folks who came before, right? What is Kendrick doing? But how is what Kendrick is doing different than what Zora Neale Hurston was doing, right? And capturing the voices and the experiences and the language and the dialect of people in their communities, and then packaging them in stories and using those stories to share with the world. So I very much, I've never ever been a good rapper. I used to want to be, but like, you know, if some people are like, oh, you must be really good at freestyling, and it's like, haha, no, I'm not. But like what that art form represents, you know, and when it is at its best, hip hop is interesting because people can be like, find the worst examples of it and say like, this isn't art, or this isn't like creative, or this isn't, but like, you know, there's good hip hop and there's bad hip hop, the same way there's good poems and bad poems and good novels and bad novels, right? Like, I think The Sun, you know, what's the name? I was gonna give a hot take, and then the universe was like, you need The Sun Also Rises. I just read The Sun Also Rises, and I was like, this is an overrated piece of literature. And like, you know, but my point is not to like, you know, make debates about the canon the centerpiece of the Q&A, but I think that my point is there are, in any genre, there are things that people are going to resonate with or not resonate with. There are good types of art and bad types of art, and hip hop is, I am adjacent to it, and it is a part of my literary lineage in many ways, and so I feel that. You know, with the ed school piece, I mean, I think that's absolutely real. You know, when I was the only black man in my PhD cohort of what, it was 25 people, and even more broadly, like in the master's program, there weren't that many of us, a handful. I mean, the ed school is a largely female school. I don't know the specific numbers, but there are not a lot. I mean, I think part of it reflects the lack of men of color in education more broadly, which exists for a range of different reasons. But you're almost done. I mean, the thing about the master's program is it like flies by. So I would just say, you know, for me, what was most important was like building community and like figuring out who my folks were, and just constantly reminding myself why I came here in the first place. You know, I think it can be very easy to, you know, have your feet kind of lifted off the ground and to get caught up in the like Harvardness of Harvard. But I think you gotta, for me, what was really important and why I started teaching in prisons out in Norfolk and why I started volunteering at different high schools doing poetry workshops was because I needed to stay connected to the reason I came into this work in the first place. Because it's cool to like sit around reading Foucault, but like, you know, and you can like talk about the panopticon, but like if you're not interfacing with incarcerated people, then like what is your theory mean? Like what is it doing if not informing how you engage with these folks in person? And that type of work and staying committed to finding ways to stay proximate to the people and the stories that led you to this in the first place were what kept me going.
Okay. My name's Carolyn Poinelli, and I'm a member of the Outside Public. Thank you very much. The connection that you made about black people their labor being worth more than all the other assets in this country, I think what's happening in this country is a recreation of that again. And there was I went to a lecture, and there's a book by a woman named Nancy McLean. It's called Democracy Unchained, or Democracy in Chains. And it talks about how the right is trying to change the Constitution today so that citizen protest is not going to matter. And I think the fact that what initiated the type of behavior that is pushing this forward is the idea that slaves were property and that you were taking away their property and you had no right to interfere with their profit, and slaves were what they were profiting off of.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It's very good, and this is the greatest protest. I expected to come here and go to sleep. It was great.
Thank you, I think.
Hi, I'm Kamara Jones, and this is the first time that I'm actually becoming familiar with your work. I'm so grateful because your work is the next iteration of my work. I'm a family physician, epidemiologist whose work is on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation. And many of your framings, I see the echo, so I look forward to us connecting.
Yeah.
But I wanted to compliment you especially on how you make history very accessible. So my question is, how do you see your role in the next several months in terms of educating a broader public about things that we need to consider coming up to the November 2020 election? Do you feel that you are an artist and trying to finish dissertating? Well, you already submitted your thing, so you're sort of freed of that. You're just waiting. But do you feel like you have a role? Because I do. And I think that your ability to take information that's been hidden or eyes closed, or all of this about history, but also about other, when I talk about American exceptionalism, part of the manifestation is how it makes us feel we don't have anything to learn from anybody else in the world. So we could learn some things about democratic socialism in Europe, for example, and what people have. Do you feel that you have a role in that, or are you just going to let it play out and try to duck or leave or?
Yeah, no, I appreciate your question. No, certainly no ducking or trying to keep out. I mean, I'm not a pundit. I don't think of myself as a political commentator. I mean, I'm a writer, and I try to take the things that I spend time researching and thinking about and understand and help people understand the connections that those historical realities have to shaping what our world looks like today. For me, one of the most important things, I think, in the next several months, we don't know who the Democratic nominee is going to be, but part of what is important for me is to remind people, to find ways to remind people that the stakes exist beyond themselves, and that I think there are a lot of people who are deeply disillusioned, and depending on what happens with the primary and and what increasingly looks like a brokered convention, depending on what happens after that, I think you might have a lot of people who are in opt-out mode, who are like, nah, I'm not doing this anymore because this is not you. The system has continuously proven that it is not interested in my voice or the people's voice, and I think a lot of that will depend on who the nominee is. But what I hope to do is to get people to consider the totality of what is at stake. And you would think that what has happened in the last 4 years would convince most people that an imperfect person is better than that. The frame that people use is lesser of two evils. I don't know. It's such a deficit-oriented frame. I think the presidency in and of itself means that you are a person who is in charge of maintaining an empire, and within that comes a job that is deeply unsavory, and that is deeply in which you are required to enforce a set of norms and expectations around the United States position in the world that I and many other people don't necessarily agree with. But I want, I work in prisons, and so part of what I think about all the time is my dissertation is on the experiences of people who were sentenced to juvenile life without parole. And so there were people who were convicted of crimes when they were 15, 16, 17 years old and told by a judge you were going to spend the rest of your life in a cage. In 2016, there was a Supreme Court ruling, Montgomery v. Louisiana, which made retroactive a 2012 Supreme Court ruling, Miller v. Alabama, which said that mandatory life without parole was unconstitutional for children, for people who were sentenced as children. And so you had thousands of people who had the opportunity to go up and have their sentence changed and to have the opportunity to get out of prison after 20, 30, 40 years in prison. And that is possible because there was a 5-4 vote on the Supreme Court. Anthony Kennedy was the swing vote. And that vote would not go in the same way now, right? Because we have two very different ideological people on the court. And that there's a scenario moving forward in which we could possibly have a 7-2 Supreme Court, and those type of rulings would never happen. And so what I always tell folks, that the folks that I work with in prison are paying as much attention to, if not more attention to the election than many of us, because their lives are literally at stake, right? A question of if they will be able to see their families again depends on who the nominee is, depends on who the next president is, who will shape what the Supreme Court looks like. And that exists on a state-by-state level, that exists. So I always try to just say, the nominee may be or may not be somebody that you are personally or deeply invested in. They may very well be somebody you have a range of qualms with, and qualms is probably a euphemism. Like, you have some real problems with this person. And I think that is legitimate. I think it is also important to ask ourselves who will suffer, like who will materially suffer if this man is reelected, and to what extent will we? You have to consider, like, it is are our principles getting in the way, or what seem to be our principles, or what we present as our principles, getting in the way of people's actual lives who may exist in places that we will never see, being impacted by this decision. I mean, climate change by itself is like a real thing. All of the candidates, the nominees, have very different ideas of climate change, but I would argue that they're all better than the nothing that exists right now. And what we know, all the scientists are telling us, that we got a few years to do this, right? And so, and the reality of climate change is that it's not going to be folks on the Upper East Side of Manhattan or the Upper West Side of Manhattan who are impacted first. It's going to be people in the global South. It's going to be people in the poor communities in Miami. It's going to be people on the coast of South Carolina, right? And so, just like kind of what I talked about before, like expanding our capacity for empathy and just hoping to get people to think holistically about the stakes and why it is important to, why I don't think opting out is a good idea.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Erica. I'm at the Kennedy School. I'm a big fan of your work, and I've used it as a teaching tool with adults and young adults. I wanted to pick up on the thread of the global understanding and just hear more of your thoughts around that. And particularly for me, I was working in Brazil this summer past and learned about these like Confederate kind of colonies, essentially, where 20,000 U.S. Confederates, white people from the South, had fled to Brazil after the Civil War when they lost. And so this idea that of kind of the global network that sustains white supremacy and keeps it intact, both how the U.S. like exports it, but just the global nature of oppression that sustains both the U.S. oppression, but also kind of concretizes institutions that allow for it. So just speaking more to that relationship.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's a really interesting, my friend Ben Weber has a book coming out about how the Confederates after the Civil War left and went to Cuba and how these folks went and were the folks who were also expanding the carceral state in these other places. So like how the carceral state in Cuba and in the Philippines and in Samoa are shaped by the legacies of people who left after the Civil War in order to find other places with which to expand their own conceptions of white supremacy. And Brazil I actually wasn't familiar with that, but it makes sense because Brazil was the last place in the world to abolish slavery. And so, for me, more generally, this sort of internationalist frame, I think in part was largely shaped by teaching undocumented students. And so I taught a lot of students who were undocumented or came from mixed status families. And it was, I think the narrative around immigration, I think people of good faith can have different conceptions of what an effective immigration system should look like. But it's interesting when we think about how proximity shapes people's notions of empathy. I'm not an immigrant. I don't come from a family of immigrants. I come from a family of people who were brought, to this country against their will. And I didn't grow up around immigrants. So being a high school teacher, working with people who had immigrated from Mexico and Central America, was a kind of experience in radical empathy, and that I was reading these stories they would write, these essays they would write, of their journeys coming to this country when they were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and their experiences once they're here of what it means to go home every day from school and to not actually know if your family will be there, right? What if ICE had come or immigration authorities had come and taken your mother or your father or your brother or your sister or your cousin, and developing a sort of larger internationalist sensibility helps me understand that it is impossible to have an analysis or an understanding of why so many people from Central America are coming to this country without understanding the history of imperialism, American imperialism in those countries, right? Like, we can't understand why people are coming from Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador and all of these other countries unless we're going to understand how the U.S. like continuously intervened in those countries, politically, economically, socially destabilized them for decades. And then when these countries find themselves experiencing political instability and turmoil, and then when these people give their life savings to strangers to get on the back of a train and to get on the back of a truck and to walk thousands of miles to a place that they've never been and to be met with nothing but vitriol at the border, I think it's hurtful, because it's hurtful even if you don't know that history, to see like people who are simply searching for a better life being met that way. But when you understand the role that our country has played in creating the conditions that these people are trying to flee in the first place, then it becomes even more, I think, insidious and egregious than it is on face value. And so I think, my understanding of history in the United States, and when I felt like I sort of reached a point where, because what I tell people is that, like, for me, all this information that I've shared with you and that I'm thinking about and that I read about, I feel very lucky to be able to write about it and come speak in rooms where people will listen. But even if I was speaking in front of empty rooms, like, it's important for me, right? Like, it's important because it is a deeply liberating and emancipatory endeavor for me to be able to understand that so much of what the world or what this country has told me is a lie. Right? And I think to be able to identify, there's so much power in being able to identify that lie, because I wasn't for so much of my life. And I felt a sort of intellectual and emotional paralysis where, like, I kept hearing these things about people who looked like me in my community, and I wouldn't know, I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to say how. Or I didn't have the history, I didn't have the sociology, I didn't have the language. And so once there was a moment, it felt like it never is done, but it sort of clicked, where I feel like I moved from, like, that paralysis to being free of it. And I was like, well, if this is what exists in a domestic context, I think I have to imagine it's similar in a historical context. And, I studied abroad in Senegal, and I lived in South Africa for a year after I graduated. And it even began early in those conversations where, you're like, oh, like, UNICEF and Bill Gates and the Millennium Goals, and this is like, malaria nets. And that's not to say those things are bad, but it's to say that when we think about the reason that the impact that colonialism had on these countries, and the reason that they are in the positions they're in the first place, it just provides a different lens and sort of analysis. So I just try to, bring that lens to any kind of space that I'm thinking about. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Zinsley. I'm a first year in the program. So I was at your colloquium thing, and you mentioned how, like, you're much different when you do your poetry things, and I felt that. So
Yeah. That's because my advisor was in the room at the jump, and I was like,
that pressure.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in Black history, the way that it's taught, and specifically how it's learned by Black children. And I find that there's, like, for all kids, we've created this antithetical relationship to, like, learning history and history curriculum. It's like, oh, it's so far long ago, it doesn't matter to me. And then with Black children, there's kind of like this double or triple hatred for history that happens when they're young, because one, they're taught, names, dates don't matter, it's really long ago, and then their history is mistreated. They watch that happen in their classrooms, and when it is talked about, these are very traumatic lessons, and so all around it, Black children kind of start to divorce themselves from history classrooms. And I feel like in schools in this country, it's very easy for educators to accept a Black child as a poet or a dancer. Like, the arts, that's seen as something that Black kids can't do. But that same, like, faith in them and celebration of them isn't brought into the classroom. And so I'm just wondering how you've experienced and what you think about the use of poetry and art as a teaching tool for Black children, because I feel like, these are painful discussions that we're having, but the whole time you're talking, I'm captivated, I'm paying attention, and I don't feel bored or like this is not something I want to learn. And you're putting dates in there, you're putting names in there. These are poems that are created from primary documents, which I feel like is really powerful. So I'm wondering, even Amanda talked about the impact you had on her reading poetry at her school all those years ago. So I'm just wondering what you've been doing, how you've seen teachers take these poems in classrooms, or like kind of what your vision for that is and the role of art in teaching Black children.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question and the kind words. I mean, I think that there's certainly an important role for the arts to play. I think it's all about like how it is implemented. So for example, you'll have a bunch of teachers, like if you have some teachers who are teaching majority Black and brown kids, a well-intentioned teacher might be like, okay, I'm gonna bring in some hip hop lyrics and we're gonna talk about how like hip hop lyrics are poetry and we'll use that to like learn poetry. That is fine, and as I've talked about, before, like hip hop is poetry, and it is something that should be taken seriously as a mode of literary production. You also don't have to. There's a fine line between like a culturally responsive pedagogy that is attempting to meet students where they are, and then a pedagogy that is like pandering to students, and a pedagogy that is saying that we are going to use hip hop because we don't think you are capable or or have the capacity with which to understand this other thing that we're teaching the white students. and that for me is deeply troubling, right? I think it's fine to use, if we're using this example, fine to use hip hop as an access point or an entry point to thinking about like what poetry is and how we can break apart and dismantle our sort of narrow conceptions of what poetry is or is not, or what we've been taught poetry is or is not. But it shouldn't end there. Right, like it shouldn't end with like, okay, now we're gonna make a dance to show, how you so you can learn biology. That's cool, and I think it's important to have like all different types of ways that people learn, but it doesn't. But I think the problem, especially when people are teaching Black children, is that it ends there, right? Like, oh, we're gonna do like a hip hop dance to learn all the different parts of the cell. And that's fine, but one should not fall into the trap of thinking that is the only way your students can learn, because you fall into the trap of making your students into tropes, and to recognizing that like it is one thing to create something that serves as a catalyst of intrigue for your students, and another to be like, oh, well, we're gonna do this because like they can't read Shakespeare, or we're gonna do this because like they can't like actually sit down and like look at things through a microscope, or they can't, you know what I mean? So I think it's about having a well-rounded, robust curriculum in which the arts are a part, in which like parts of cultural production that are specific to these communities come in and play an important role, but do not necessarily replace a sort of larger, rigorous curriculum that our students shouldn't be kept from simply because people have an idea that like they're not capable of accessing it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm not supposed to say that. I think he's supposed to say that.
Thank you so much. Have a great night. Thank you, Clint. That was fantastic.